My name's Kyle Goodfriend. I work for Huron Consulting. I see many faces that look familiar in here, so I'm glad you guys all stuck around and got up this morning. I'm going to do a deep dive on not necessarily Groovy, but the grid builder in Groovy. So I'm going to do a really high level overview of what Groovy can do and why I think it's so groundbreaking and it'll change your life in so many ways. I think you'll really appreciate it. How many people in here use Groovy? Just a couple. Do you guys know what it is? Kind of? Okay. So I'll start off and just say that if you got any questions, just jump in. This is an open forum. You guys are here to learn, and we're all here to share knowledge. So if somebody has a better solution than what I'm suggesting, you're more than welcome to jump in and say it. I'm not going to bore you with my history, but I started off in accounting and finance, hated my job, figured out a way to not do my job, and voila, I ended up doing this for the rest of my life. I started using Groovy on a client about 2 months after it was released. It was released, I believe, in June or July of last year. And the reason that I started investigating the possibilities was because we had two very critical objectives that weren't being solved without Groovy. And they surrounded performance. There were forms that were taking minutes to save, and we were doing the smart pushes that was talked about earlier, and those smart pushes were taking a while. We were running into errors, memory errors, and things like that. So the client was sold that PBCS was real-time reporting. And what I mean by real-time reporting is that if you have a workforce module with dimensions like employee and union and job title, if somebody goes in and change a person from union to non-union, and then they go over into the P&L cube that doesn't have all that detail, they'll be able to run a report and see the results. So if they change the person or if they change the product at a SKU level, they wanted to be able to go to the consolidated P&L and actually see the impact. Which, as you guys all know, when you have multiple modules, it doesn't sync directly immediately. You have to consolidate employee, union, job title, all that stuff, and then push it over. So there were a couple different things that we had to solve. So Groovy basically gives you the ability to interact with almost every aspect of PBCS or ePBCS. If I say PBCS, I really mean ePBCS. Groovy is released in ePBCS and PBCS plus 1. So if you buy PBCS and then you buy just one module, or if you buy 2 PBCS pods, that's considered PBCS plus 1. So if you ask me if it's available in PBCS, it's not. I'm going to use PBCS because I get tongue-tied when I say ePBCS. So Groovy's available and it can interact. You basically change your calculation scripts to a Groovy calculation script, and then you have all this functionality that you never had before, or depending on how old you are, you had 15 years ago when we used to edit JavaScript in the planning web forms, and you could do some of this. But basically where we stood is when a person saved a web form, the business logic on the form took 20 to 30 seconds. The smart push took 15 seconds. And then the consolidation took a little over a minute, minute and a half to get that data pushed over to the consolidated P&L cube. So if you add that up, you're talking about 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes. So every time somebody saved a form, it took 3 minutes. And they said absolutely no way, that's not acceptable. With Groovy, what we're able to do is we're able to loop through all the cells in the form. We're able to identify which rows and which columns changed. And then we're able to use those and dynamically generate an S-base calculation. So if you think about if you have vendors down the rows and you have 1,000 vendors that have data, even with suppression, if you change one line, your calculation in S-base is at relative, so it actually calculates all 1,000 of those vendors, even though you only changed one. So basically what this does is it allows you to dynamically generate the S-base calc. So you do what you did in a business rule, except instead of doing I descendants of vendor, you create an array of the lines that changed, and then you fix on only those 2, 3, 4, 1, 7, whatever vendors. Same thing with months. Instead of doing calculations on all 12 months, you can only do the months that changed. And I know the dense and the sparse, if you only do on certain months, the calculation doesn't change much. if at all. But the smart push does, because the smart push is an amount of data. So you can also pass those variables to the smart push. And instead of doing all 12 months, you only do 2 months. Instead of doing 1,000 rows of vendors, you only do 3 rows of vendors. So your smart push is almost immediate. Okay? And then the third piece is we push that to the consolidated P&L cube without your detail of your products and SKUs, and without your detail of your workforce like union and job title. And basically what we do, and this is what I'm going to talk about today, we use the Grid Builder and Groovy to almost simulate what you guys are going to do in a smart view, retrieve and a submit. So if you think about changing the union on one person, we push that one person to the workforce ASO cube with the smart push. Okay, so now ASO is updated. We do a retrieve at total employee, total union, total job type, whatever your dimensions are. We do a retrieve at that level, and then we have another connection to the P&L cube. We copy the data to the other smart view sheet, if you look at it that way, and hit submit. That's basically what the Grid Builder allows you to do in Groovy. So it completely eliminates any consolidation, and it takes it one step further than what John talked about. So if you just do the pushes, it takes away the consolidation and the movement of data from your workforce cube to your reporting workforce cube, but it doesn't consolidate the data and push it over to the P&L cube, because the smart pushes won't source from an ASO cube. Does that make sense to everybody? So the client that I implemented this at literally has workforce CapEx and a gross profit model. Any one line they change, they can immediately run a report, an FR or a smart view, and see consolidated numbers at the P&L. That is incredibly huge, and I was expecting some people to be doing backflips by now, and nobody is, so you're making me really sad. But do you guys see the advantage of this? The benefits, I hope? Okay. And think about this. Groovy allows you to do all kinds of things that you can't do in a business rule. So how many in here that have been doing this a while would have ever thought that you could write a planning application and never use an S-based calculation? Anybody ever think that? It's possible now. So we have another client that a coworker of mine has implemented, actually in 2 different places. No S-based calculations are written, none. Currency conversion, allocations, rate times volume, all that stuff is done in Groovy, and all of the web forms sit on an ASO cube. So BSO is it is irrelevant in that implementation. And all the functionality that you would want to build in an S-based calculation, you have now done in Groovy. So it's pretty cool. I'm going to check the time. So I've been talking for what, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, is that right? 20. All right. So we're going to struggle going through all of the examples in here, but if you want to change a calculation from a regular calculation to a Groovy calculation, you change the view to edit, and then there's a little drop down over to the right that has a Groovy script. And we talked about most of this. So the Grid Builder concepts, and this deck has code for 4 or 5 different examples that I'm more than happy to give you. Again, send me an email, I'll send it to you, I'll post it at Into Hyperion, you can download it, and then I don't even ever get your email. But the Grid Builder has two different objects. There's a read builder basically and a write builder. They both work for the most part the exact same way. And if you understand how to put a smart view template together, you understand the Grid Builder. You got a POV, column headers, row headers, and data. That's it. Okay? There are some limitations, so sometimes you'll have to iterate through different point of views if your point of view is large to move data back and forth. And the reading is 500,000, the writing is 200,000. We talked about some of the benefits, some of the creative uses, mapping data from one cube to another. So in your workforce, you might have different account codes. than your P&L. So you can't do mapping in a smart push, but with the grid builder you can. So that takes that out of the equation. It almost acts like a relational channel. The methods, you create the grid, you specify the data, and you save the data. And again, I'm not making it complicated because it's not. It's literally exactly like a smart view template. Same thing with the grid definition builder. You retrieve the data, and you can use functions like @descendants, level 0, all of those things. By the way, the grid builder, when you're reading large amounts of data, it is incredibly fast, especially from ASO. And it kind of made me aware of how much overhead SmartView has in Excel, because I can do a grid builder retrieve so much faster than you can do in a SmartView. So if you're retrieving large sets of data, it's not going to be the same as what you're experiencing in SmartView. So here's an example, and I only have a few minutes. So here's an example of, I'm going to go through 2 examples real quick, and then I'm just going to give you some ideas of some other things that you can do. So the first one is reading. So if you notice here, I'm setting up a grid, and I'm connecting it to a plan type. And then the second section is setting up the point of view in the columns. So this basically, your point of view is 5 dimensions, and your columns, you have month and year, period and year in the columns. So you have 2 column headers. And then you add rows. So department and employee is in the row, and then you're setting the data that you want to be in that row. And then down here at the bottom, you're basically submitting it, you're retrieving status, and then you can log that status to your job console. So this is probably the most complicated part of Groovy to get it to work, because it's hard for several reasons, but conceptually it's extremely simple. The read is even easier. So again, you connect to a plan type, you initiate the grid builder, you add the point of view. So the point of view has a little bit different syntax. You add your columns and you add your rows, and notice on the rows you're not adding data because you're reading. Okay, and in this example, I did level 0 descendants of grades, and then you're retrieving that. And again, you can log this information to the log. Notice that the load grid has a parameter at the end. It's true or false. This is whether you want to use the person's security, and if you do, then you're going to get no access if they don't have access to something. I typically use it or set it to false because I want that specific data, even if they have access to it or not, that I'm moving. So just some real world examples, and I'll speed through this, but the code is all in here. Clearing data in ASO, I've had several people reach out to me and say that they basically want to be able to run an MDX query on the ASO using the point of view in on a form saved in a calculation. And there's no way to do that. With Grid Builder, you actually can. So that's one thing that you can use this for. Again, all the details in here, so you guys can walk away with this. The real-time reporting, which we already talked about. So this is changing an employee and having it push all the way over to your P&L cube. We talked about mapping different accounts, so that can all be done with the Grid Builder. Calculating outside of SBase. Again, this is another thing that I talked about. You can actually run your calculations completely outside of SBase and store them in BSO or ASO. So in here, I actually have an example where it uses an account map, so it's doing data mapping. It also is doing currency conversion. And this piece right here is very interesting. So this currency conversion, I'm actually doing a query on the metadata, finding out if it's an account that should be converted or not. So like head count doesn't get converted, even if it's another currency. So I'm actually identifying whether that account needs to be converted. I mean, all of that stuff that you typically do with if statements and fixes inside of an SBase calc, you can do in Groovy. It's different, but you can do it. So the code is all here. So this is the currency rates map. How to write back to the data. This is really small, but this is an example of adding all the rows and submitting the data. So this is an example of the log, and people asked me in the other sessions that I was doing how you debug this. Usually I write out everything to the job console, and when you write out lists and maps to the job console, it it's a delimited list. So I usually try to set this and then copy this, and I can paste it into Excel. It's comma delimited, so you get your columns and rows, and you literally have a smart view retrieve. So that's what I would suggest on debugging. Notice at the bottom here, it tells you how many cells are accepted. Most of the time when I have issues, it's because my point of view on my source and target are wrong. So I come in here and look, and I know it's writing data to SBase, but I'm not seeing it. And it's just like you guys all experience, you know, when you're testing a calculation and you're doing your retrieves and you spend an hour or 2 hours trying to figure out why your calculation's not working, and it was working all along. It's just that you had the wrong point of view in your spreadsheet and you were looking at the wrong, you know, result. And don't say that you haven't done it. Just a couple suggestions. Process segmentation. So any of this Groovy script that you're using that you can reuse, like the map for account to account, any functions that you create, you can put those in a script and then drag the script into the rule just like you do with any other SBase calculation. So anything that's reusable, I highly recommend you put in a script and then link it to your rules. And here's an example of just proving out that it can work. But the last thing I'll leave you with is that I struggled. I'm not a Groovy developer. I'm not a Java developer. And I struggled a lot with some of this information and getting it to work. And if you compartmentalize a couple of different things, one, understand that there's an API that PBCS has that's documented, and that you can actually look up and reference and kind of figure out. Then there's another aspect of the Groovy, and you'll start learning Groovy. And then where you're going to struggle is where you use Groovy to call the APIs. And there's a lot of syntax that, depending on how you write your Groovy, the API is different. So instead of using get POV, it's just POV. And I would look at examples and ask why. I mean, it says get POV. Why does POV work and get POV doesn't? And everybody would always come back and say, well, that's Groovy. If you know Groovy, then you'd know that. So if you get into this, you're probably going to struggle. And all I can say is, for me, it helped to try to figure out whether it was a Groovy issue or an API issue or how they work together. And over the last 6 to 12 months, I've actually gotten relatively efficient at understanding where my issue is. If you go out into Hyperion, I have, I think, 22 of these. I've got some more that I'm writing. But there's examples, there's code, there's everything that you would need to get to do everything that we've done, or everything that I've done in this session. So the code in here is a little bit different, but you can actually go out and there's a narrative on all these different pieces in 20 to 30 articles to try to help you get up to speed with Groovy. There's also some webinars and things out on Into Hyperion you can look at and might be helpful. So I'm running out of time, and I don't want to keep you guys. I know everybody's probably ready to get out of here. So thank you very much for coming. Leo, is there anything else you want to add? Oh, do I? Oh, I thought I was out of time. How long do I have? Okay, cool. All right, so let's take some questions, and then I can go and deep dive into some of this code if you guys want. So. Yes, I'm going to give it to him, and he's going to make it download. But I'll also post it on Into Hyperion if you want to go there and download it as well. Yes? All right, good question. Is Groovy cloud, and can you do it on-prem? So the answer is kind of muddy. You can use Groovy on-prem, so you can write a business rule and you can create a custom-defined function if anybody's ever written CDFs. So you can use Groovy to write a CDF, and you can use Groovy that way. On the cloud, it's much more embedded in the calculation logic. So things like finding out which cells are edited, you can do in cloud. You can't do that on-prem. The roadmap for on-prem, what I've told is basically they're never going to add it. And I think that's probably a strategic direction, to push people to the cloud. So if you're expecting it to be on-prem, it's going to be probably long after, who knows. I don't know that it'll ever be added. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Use cases to plug into a member formula. That's a good question. I don't think it's possible. That's a good question. I've never tried it. I don't think it's possible, but yeah, I don't think you can. But I mean, if you can, gosh, there's all kinds of things you could do, right? I mean, one of the things that I could think of off the bat is there's a lot of stuff in S-based calculations that are slow, like grabbing the member name, doing any string concatenations, any manipulations of information like that is very slow in an S-based calculation. And in Groovy, you can do that and then send the result to the S-based calculation so it speeds it up. If you can use it in member formulas, I can think of all kinds of things, you know, like that. Smart list, you're able to get the smart list text. You know, so we did a thing where in Workforce where you map from A to B. They have a drop-down list, so the smart list is connected to the departments. So in the drop-down list, you select the department, and then in the Groovy calculation, you can actually get the department, which is the member name, and then do your S-based calculation to move the data from, you know, member A to member B. So there's all kinds of things like that that you can do. And if they would make it available in member formulas, I could see things like that being very, very useful. Yep.
They're actually bringing Groovy pretty basically through the EPM cloud. And I interviewed Mike Casey this week, who is the product manager for FDMEE, who said that Groovy eventually will be a scripting language you're able to use with FDMEE as well.
Yeah, so Groovy is an open source language. It sits on top of Java, is the best way I can explain it, and it's been explained to me. It allows you to, you know, where Java might take 10 or 15 lines, it allows you to do it in one. And I compare it to PowerShell. PowerShell is the same way. If you use VB script and you've got this much VB script, you can do it in 1 or 2 lines in PowerShell. It's kind of the same comparison in Groovy. And my understanding is, and I'm 99% sure that I'm correct, is that PBCS is built with Groovy. So it's not like it's a fad. It's not like they're going to have it and then it's going to go away. I mean, the whole application was built on Groovy. So it's embedded in if they took Groovy out, they have to rewrite the entire application. So the question is, why is it in PBCS and ePBCS? It's money. I'll be honest with you. I've asked the question and I've gotten some honest feedback from some of the Oracle developers, and it's purely financial.
So FDMEE is only on premise. So there's DM in the cloud, which doesn't have scripting. The other thing he said is someday it will. They just have to figure out how to lock it down enough, so you don't run del star on star. Only FDMEE script.
If anybody uses HSL or strategic modeling, so strategic modeling in ePBCS, Groovy works with that. So I'm actually working with some people right now where they'll go in and do a long-range strategic plan, and when they save their forms in the long-range strategic plan, it actually pushes to the planning application. So the strategic modeling app and the planning app talk back and forth with Groovy and are in sync. Yes, sir. So if you don't know anything about Groovy, where do you start? So in the deck, I've got about, I don't know, 8 to 10 different places that are a good place to start. So one, the PBCS admin guide has a section in there specifically on the Groovy, all the methods, all the calls, all the properties. And so that's a good place to go to get information on the API. However, it doesn't do squat if you don't know Groovy. So there's a list of other things around here, or other things in this slide, that will give you access to tons of information. And if you've ever looked at anything, I mean, Google, I don't know how to do half this stuff, or didn't a year ago. And so I would Google Groovy, how do I concatenate a list? How do I parse a list? How do I do this? How do I do that? So the groovy.lang.org is kind of the home center for the open source application. So it has tons of information. The one thing that I would suggest is there's a lot of data that is returned in collections, lists, and strings. So the one thing that I would highly recommend is if you're going to spend time and just learn Groovy would be to understand strings, the different kinds of strings. I would look at maps and how to manipulate maps. And I would look at collections and lists and understand what they mean and how they are used. And there's a lot of times where when I started out, I was actually taking lists that would be returned, converting those to a comma delimited string, and then placing them inside of a list that the API needed. And I really made my life a lot harder because if it's returned in a list and the API is accepting a list, I just passed the list. So I was doing a ton of stuff that I didn't have to do. So I think it'd be valuable to start there: strings, lists, collections, and maps. Yep.
Good question. So, as someone that's just starting, so I don't know if you would like this, but I used to write, cal scripts and SPace and then put business rules. So, what's a tool that you're using to write Ruby and to be able to check your syntax?
Yep.
And then plug it? Are there
So.
Notepad, some similar?
So yeah, so there's applications that are free. There's applications that you can pay for. The one that I've been using is just the Groovy. If you go to Groovy Lang, they have their own application. It's not that good. It doesn't do auto fills and things like that, like Visual Basic does or PowerShell does. So if you start getting into this, you may want to invest some money into, spend a couple $100 and buy an application that will help you with that.
They won't give you like the arguments.
Nothing like that. Yeah. Right. It'll tell you that it's wrong if you try to run it. But that's what I use. It was free. So the challenge that I have and that you will have is that you can't test your code in a business rule in any other application because the API is not there. So if you're looping through a grid and you're trying to make a list of all the vendors or the rows that have changed, it's not like you can copy that over to Groovy and test it. So you kind of do a lot of debugging inside of the business rule, and just like any other language that you don't have, stepping through, just like S-based calcs used to be, you can kind of do it now in ePBCS, but I'd write lines out to the log. I got to line 1, I got to line 12, I got to line 30, and the console will tell you the error, and it'll tell you what line it erred on. And then I would basically take that line, and if it was something that it was a Groovy function, like I was trying to split a list apart, I would take that, and then I would go over to the Groovy application and get it to work, and then I would paste it back into the business rule. So it's not perfect, and that's why I think I struggled a lot, because there's 2 or 3 different places you have to go to get this to work. And again, that's where I struggled with, is this a Groovy issue? Is it an API issue? And once you make that connection and you understand it, it becomes a lot easier to fix some things that aren't working. Anybody else have any questions? Anybody want me to go through anything specific that we talked about? I can go through these examples. Would that be helpful? Do you want to see a demo of an application? I'm here for you guys, so.
Can we do a demo of the application?
Sure. So, I'll just walk through one of the forms. So this override form lets people override price growth rate of cases and some gross profit percentages, and it applies it to everything below that if you select a parent. And then it dynamically goes through the grid, it figures out which rows were changed, and dynamically does the data push, it does the S-based calc, it does the synchronization to the P&L cube. So if I go in here and change a couple of these, and I hit save, and I haven't used it this morning, so it might take a little bit longer, but so what this is doing right now is it's saving the data, it's running an S-base calculation, dynamically generating the fixed statements so that the S-base calculation is quicker. Then it's doing the data push, the smart push, and it's pushing the data over to the gross profit reporting cube, and then it's using the grid builder to retrieve the totals and submit those to the P&L. So that took not very long to do all of that. All in business rules. Yep. There's 2 or 3 that it runs, but yeah, it's all in business rules. So again, real-time reporting. Like I saved 3 products, and there's 4 dimensions in this application that don't exist in the P&L cube. So if I go over and run a report, and I didn't change it very much, but if I refresh this, I should see some data change a little bit. All right, so it changed quite a bit. So if I go over to this validation sheet, I have an error. Basically, this RGP is the ASO cube for the GP model. The fin is the fin application, the BSO, and then the RFin is the ASO. So right now they're out of sync. If I refresh all of these sheets, bang. So if I look at the log, honestly, it probably only took about 2 seconds to save that form. The rest of it was just overhead and refreshing the form. There's 35,000 vendors, so you're doing suppression and on all of that stuff on the refresh. But this is what blows me away is, I mean, I changed 3 vendors at a detailed level, and I can go to the P&L cube and I get the impact right away. It's crazy. Some other things that are very cool is the pre-save validation. So if you ever have issues with people entering data that doesn't make sense, this fixes that problem. For example, if I go over to this phasing form, there's 12 months of data, and if I scroll over a little bit, I'll see the numbers that are actually in there. So there's 2 validations that run on this form. One, if you're adjusting the cases, the units in this case, you can't change the units for the full year. So if you remove 10, you got to add 10 somewhere. The other thing is if you remove 10 and it only had 8, it's going to go to -2, and I don't want to ever let anybody sell -2 cases, okay? So if I look at this line right here, I've got 263 cases, 379. If I subtract 250 cases and add 300 cases, I don't net to 0. So if I try to save this, it's going to come back and say you have an error. The difference with this is that this data is not saved. It's not like you ran an S-base calculation after the data was saved and you used the @return and said you have a problem. This data hasn't changed anything yet. It's never been submitted to the database. So if you go over and you put your cursor over, and it's going to be hard for you to read, but it basically says, hey, you've made a change and the net isn't 0, so I'm not going to let you save this form. If I go over here and make this -500 and 500 and try to save this, it's going to stop me because it's -500, and it's going to make a negative amount of 236.5, so I can't save it. So if I change this to -10 and I change this to 5 and 5 and save it, it'll let me save it. And again, on save, doing the exact same thing, saving the data, running the calculations, doing the smart pushes, doing the consolidation and moving over to the P&L. So if I run a report, it'll all be updated. So if I come over, I didn't make much of a change, but I think it was 263 or something, so I reduced that by 10. I have done things where there's been thresholds of profit margin, and they've asked me that, they said, I don't want anybody to be able to put in above 30% or -10% for a profit margin. And then they run into cases where there's a reason. Maybe it's a new product, or you're sunsetting a product or whatever, and maybe there is a reason to go over 30 or -10. Is there any way we can kind of warn people and force a comment? Guess what? There is. So if you put in 40% profit and you try to save it, it's going to say there's no cell comment. I'm not letting you save it. If you add a cell comment to the cell, it'll let you save it. So at least you give them the ability to go over or above a threshold, but you also require a comment. Again, they can put a comment like, screw you, I guess, but, right? But it still requires them to enter a comment. So the things that you can do with this are totally, it's really up to your imagination. Yes, sir.
What is that Groovy script live and those validations? Is that a business rule or is that?
It is. It's in a business rule, and when it's on a pre-save, so you know when you set up the business rules, you got, I don't know, there's 4 or 5, right? So the pre-save is when this business rule runs, and it loops through all the cells, and it does the math, and if any cell doesn't comply with the rules, then you initiate the error and on that cell, and you can make it whatever color you want. You know, if it's close to being right, maybe you make it yellow. If it's really bad, you make it red, you know, whatever. And then you can add a cell comment to it. Sure. So I have that in the presentation in the real time. Are you talking about the validation? And just so you know the speed of this application, if you think I'm hoodwinking you, this is the production application with data randomized and member names changed of the client that I implemented this at, but it's actually twice as big. So it's bigger than what they have, and you know, you're still getting the performance that you see. So because it's kind of small, I'm going to blow it up a little bit, so I'm going to have to scroll a little bit when I make it larger, but it's, you know, there's almost more commented lines than there are lines of code. So basically, I'm looping through the grids, and I'm only looping through the edited cells because there's no reason. I'm assuming that the last time somebody saved it, it did the same thing, and I don't have to validate stuff that's not there. This case total, this cross dim is probably going to be your best friend with this stuff. This is basically like the cross dim in an S-based calculation. So what I'm doing is I'm adding up all 12 months, and I'm not using year total because year total would be wrong because it'd be pulling it from S-base and it wouldn't, you know, it wouldn't be right yet. So I'm adding up all 12 months, and then coming in here and saying basically, does the data, is it not 0? If it's not 0, then I, you know, cause an error. This one right here is looping through, and it's looking at the cross dim of the same cell 12 cells over. So it's the difference between version and version. So I'm basically saying, give me the same cell with the exact same POV, except I want to change the input version to the working version. All right. So that's telling me, or that's returning whether I'm negative or not. Okay. And then down here, if the total doesn't equal 0, then establish an error. So, you know, outside of the ifs, I mean, you figure this is a print line to the log. That's a print to the log. That's the extent of validating whether it nets to 0 and whether the same cell in the other version is a negative number if I make a change.
You guys tell Google this is Groovy, not KScope language?
Yes, sir, you do. So if I create a new rule, it's the best way I can show you. So the question was, do you have to tell the business rule to be a Groovy business rule? So I'll create a new business rule. And when this opens, this designer, I change to edit, which a lot of you probably do is the first thing you go into these rules anyway. And then my screen's not large enough, so I have to expand, you know, the toolbar. But down here, the script type, you change it to Groovy. And that's all you got to do.
Once you write it, can you still do it in the
You can't change it, so it wouldn't show you anything different if you went into the other mode, but you actually can. I mean, if I change it to a calc script, it's oh, the visual? No. Yes, sir.
If Groovy is only available in ePBCS Plus or ePBCS, so let's say you've developed your application in ePBCS
Yes, sir.
or ePBCS Plus, and you extract the LCM, you take it to ePBCS application and it still work.
So the question is, if you hack PBCS, basically, right? If you develop this in ePBCS and then you migrate it from one pod to another or the same pod as an ePBCS pod, what happens? So one, I've never tried to do it because when you create a new application, you have, and it's changed a little bit, but I think you have 3 or 4 options, whether it's, I don't know, like the one app or I can't remember what they all are. PBCS. So my guess is when you migrate it, it knows. If it doesn't know, it would still import the rules, but they wouldn't. My guess is they wouldn't do anything. I've never tried it.
So yeah, it won't work because it's enterprise type of application type, so it's kind of contained.
Yeah. I mean, if you just did an import from an LCM, I think because you don't specify on a new instance what the type is. So if you do an LCM from something that you move from somewhere else, it would know, I would think. Yes. That's where I was 6 months or 12 months ago.
How can I get access to a test PBCS?
So how can you get access to a pod to play with? That's a great question. So you can go to demos.oracle.com, I believe is the URL, and you can request a temporary pod. It's not gonna work very well because you only get it for 3 or 4 days, and it's really for demoing and a product and like a pre-sales engagement. I think you have to have a partner ID to even get access to it. So, and the other option is to buy it. So it'd be great if you could get a VM with it, where you only had 1 license or something to play with it. I would love if Oracle would do that, but you know, they did when it was new. They used to, yeah. And the Oracle reps have them. I've offered a lot of money, but nobody's ever taken it. So, but it's an issue for me too because our organization has 3 or 4 of them, and everybody's fighting for them to do demos and things. So it's hard. I think it's a gap that I'd love it to be fixed. You know, where we could have a demo environment that you could only have 1 user connect or something. Is there another question in the back? So I don't have to be anywhere today. I'm driving to southern Florida to go on vacation, and I don't need to be there until 5, and it's a 3-hour drive. So it's noon. If you guys want to come up and ask me anything or exchange some ideas or have some ideas that I could learn from, then that's awesome. So I'll stick around. So I think we're now out of time. All right.
So, guys,
Thank you.